it's now possible to introduce virtually any gene into the germline and study the expression of that gene in the context of the original animal or plant's genome. With the completion of a rough draft of the human genome in 2000, this led us to the natural extension of studies, and using the technologies has brought us to a point where genetic manipulations in humans are now possible. And that's the focus of today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists, Christopher Hook, an Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Hematology from the Mayo Clinic, Scott Carson, an Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department at Ohio University, with research interests and expertise in the history and philosophy of natural sciences, including genetics, and Scott Robe, an Athens area attorney and scholar of history, philosophy, and ethics. Each of the panelists is going to provide a brief opening statement, and then we will progress to a period of questions to hear from the panel what their thoughts are. As we progress to the question session, there's a microphone at the front of the studio here for audience to offer questions. Please keep your questions focused and so the panels can respond to your particular issue. Dr. Hook, would you like to get us started?
Thank you very much, Professor. And I wanted to thank Christi for the invitation to participate in this program, and the pleasure of meeting my panelists and looking forward to our conversation. I need to state that my comments are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Mayo Clinic or any of its programs. What I hope to do in my few opening remarks is to begin to highlight some of the questions and the challenges that we will be faced with properly implementing the explosion of genetic information and technologies. As a hematologist, I use genetic information literally every day in my practice. And it has revolutionized the care of many of my patients in substantial ways. And we live in very exciting times because of this. And I anticipate many more means of successfully treating difficult diseases for my patients in the future. Having said that, what I also hope for the future is that we can properly use this extremely powerful amount of information and these tools to human flourishing rather than to the creation of more human pain. And I want to begin by first cautioning us to be very careful about the hype that has often been used with used in the context of genetic information. We hear claims that, well, just as we're celebrating a little over 10 years since the initial publication of the first drafts of the human genome, there was an expectation that by this particular point in time we would be curing a number of diseases that we're nowhere close to being able to do so with this genetic information, that we would be using genetic therapy as a means of treatment for some diseases, and we still hope to accomplish that. But biological reality is often far more complex than our understanding at any one given period of time. And gene therapy is just now beginning to make a few preliminary steps forward. And so that I hope that we will proceed with caution and not raise false expectations for individuals, leading them to be disappointed. Another concern I have with the explosion of genetic information is a sense of genetic reductionism. When the Human Genome Project was first publicized by Walter Gilbert and James Watson back in the 80s, we heard claims such as, to know the human genome is to know what it means to be human. Or, as Dr. Watson had stated, we used to believe our fate was in the stars, now we know it's in our genes. And if the history of the 20th century should teach us anything, it is that we are more than our genetic proclivities. That information, such as genetic information, can be used to debase and demean other members of the human family and lead us to have diminished expectations of ourselves, our neighbors, our children. And we must resist this radical genetic reductionism very strongly. We also need to recognize that these technologies, which have tremendous potential for good, also have dual use potential. That the ability to understand the genetic makeup of human beings or bacteria or viruses can also be used sometimes for nefarious purposes. Just in the last couple of years, there was the significant controversy about the publishing of the genome of the H5N1 virus and the potential that that could be used as a weapon as opposed to simply an instrument for the treatment of a significant viral illness. And so do we have sufficient safeguards in place for this use of genetic information? This is an important question. As DNA databases are created and it is easier to sequence whole-scale genomes, how will this information be protected? There's been a lot of concern just in the past few months about the surveillance state that we seem to be living in here in the United States. And as healthcare policies are changing and there is more of a centralization of control over our healthcare, how will our genetic information be used? And who will have access to it? And for what purposes? Will it always be for healing? I think we have to be asking these questions. And my last comments before I will turn it over to my colleagues is that I want us to focus on the concerns of justice as it applies to genetic information. And when I speak of justice, I'm considering all 5 forms of justice. First is forensic. Who has standing? The history of the eugenics movement, about which I will speak at length tonight, is an illustration in which people were denigrated or considered of no worth or value to the community because of potential genetic predispositions. Are we going to use this information to diminish the value of our fellow human beings? Retributive justice. The eugenics program again showed ways in which people were punished for their genetic inheritance. And is that ever an appropriate way in which a society should treat its members? Restorative justice, which should be our major goal in the use of any medical information, to heal. But there are those who want to go beyond healing, dissatisfied with normal as not being good enough, wanting to tweak or enhance humans genetically. Is that a proper mission for the use of this information? Is that even an acceptable goal of medicine, which has historically been a healing art, not a pursuit of wish fulfillment? Commutative justice, fairness. Again, the human the eugenics project shows us ways in which well-meaning individuals, the technocratic elite, may pursue the nonsensical idea of a superior race or superior individuals. And how will fairness be maintained with the use of this information? And lastly, distributive justice. While I in no way wish to diminish what we are expanding or learning, I am also struck by the fact that according to WHO data, 1/3 of the deaths that occur worldwide each year are still due to communicable disease, dirty water, malnutrition. With such a significant concern upon our plate in caring for our fellow human beings, how much should we be expending in the consideration of trying to design new human beings? And with that, I thank you.
I also would like to thank Radio Christi and the organizers of this panel discussion and my co-panelists. I'm glad to be here. My remarks are more of a philosophical nature, and I'm assuming, though, that people will be able to see some of the connections between what I have to say and what Dr. Hook has said and what Mr. Robe might say. Let me start, though, with a little story. In 1990, Robert Berger, a heart surgeon at New England Deaconess Hospital and Harvard Medical School, published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in which he showed that the work that the Nazis had done in 1942 and 1943, allegedly to study the effects of hypothermia by exposing prisoners at Dachau to various forms of torture, could not really count as scientific research. The methods were sloppy and in some cases non-existent. Data were not reliably recorded, and no baseline data had been collected. This is important not because it serves as further evidence, if more were needed, of the barbarity of the Nazi regime, but because there had been a lively debate about the moral acceptability of using these data in contemporary hypothermia research. If the work had really been carried out in a scientific way, some argued, the data could serve a valuable purpose today in helping to develop treatments for hypothermia, and the suffering of those prisoners would not have been in vain. But others argued that the data ought not to be used precisely because of that suffering and because of the methods used to collect them. Unwilling subjects had been cruelly tortured, and it would be to compound the wrong done then to make use of those data now. Berger's paper rendered the debate an academic one, since the data were worthless from a scientific point of view. But the episode raises for us what I take to be one of the central questions that is before us today. Are we willing, as a society, to put the value of scientific knowledge and its possible benefits ahead of certain moral principles that we have long been accustomed to honoring? If we can gain a certain kind of knowledge that promises great benefits to humankind, but only at a price, are we willing to pay that price no matter what it is? Philosophers like to draw distinctions, so here's an old favorite for you from the domain of ethics. Ought implies can. You cannot claim that anyone has a moral obligation to do something that literally cannot be done. But the implication does not go the other way. Can does not imply ought. Simply because we can do something, even something that will provide us with a great benefit, it does not follow that we ought to do that thing. For example, if we could cure cancer or AIDS by performing the sorts of experiments that the Nazis performed on their prisoners in the concentration camps, surely we would forego that opportunity and look for other ways to accomplish the same goal. But what if we came to believe that the Nazi methods were the only way, or the quickest way, or the least expensive way to achieve that goal? Would we do it? Personally, I like to believe that most of us would recoil at such a suggestion. But I think there will always be some folks for whom the benefit is always worth the cost, just as long as the cost does not affect them personally, but the benefit does. The ethical dimension of this question before us today can be approached from many theoretical starting points, but if I were a betting man, I would wager that many people are, when it comes down to enjoying some benefit, utilitarian in their orientation. For the utilitarian, the rightness or the wrongness of the course of action lies in the prospective benefit of that course of action, either to the individual or to society, depending on the variety of utilitarianism one happens to espouse. So in considering the question whether we ought to pursue this or that program of genetic engineering in order to bring about some alleged benefit to humankind, there will probably be a large contingent of people who will argue that, yes, if the benefit is the right sort of benefit, then we ought to do whatever it takes to secure that benefit. The problem becomes rather complex, however, as soon as we try to say a little more about what we mean by the right sort of benefit. Do we mean nothing more than better health, greater longevity, less frailty, and susceptibility to disease? Or do we mean something more? Happier, more intelligent people, perhaps? Or a certain distribution of phenotypes in the population, or even a certain distribution of populations across the environment? It isn't clear that all of these goals are really accessible to genetic engineering, but it is clear that some of them are. Whatever goals we set our sights upon, however, to the utilitarian, one thing will be clear. The goals will represent our values, and our values will settle for us the question whether we ought or ought not to pursue this or that program of genetic engineering. And in a democratic society, a type of society that we sometimes claim to value and to want to spread around the globe, it will be the values of the majority. It does not take a great deal of imagination to conjure up a scenario in which the values of some majority in a population are repugnant or even harmful to many members of this or that minority within the same population. One has only to consider the work of the Nazis at Dachau, for example, to see that this sort of thing not only can happen, but often does. If anyone is beginning to think, however, that this separation of methods from goals is beginning to amount to a pretty good argument against utilitarianism, they would be moving a little too quickly. The utilitarian does not need to accept the claim that a valuable goal will automatically justify any means that could bring it about, just so long as the cost is not too great. The utilitarian can claim that the methods deployed in bringing about the goal also reflect our values, and we may very much want to avoid living in a society in which a majority is permitted to inflict horrendous suffering on even a very small number of people, even if there is much to gain from doing so. Moreover, the present state of our technology suggests that advances in human well-being could be made by means of genetic engineering without inflicting any suffering on anyone. So the utilitarian could claim that this whole line of argumentation is just a red herring. But that reply from the utilitarian would also be a little too quick, because it presupposes that the values and goals of today will continue to be the values and goals of the future. But we have no more reason to suppose that the values of some future generation will be like our own than a defender of slavery in 1830 had any reason to suppose that we would share his values today. Indeed, even the claim that we today do not want to live in a society that uses other persons as a means to our own ends belies in a particularly benighted way the present state of affairs in the world. Just to take a quick and easy example that is not far removed from our topic, I suspect that most people in this room do not attach the same value to a human embryo that they attach to the person sitting next to them. This difference in valuation is not grounded in any principled argument drawn from the biological sciences, because there is no such argument. It rather reflects our innate attraction to what is similar, our tribalism, if you will. Embryos do not seem to be anything like the fully developed human being sitting next to me, so why should I value them in the same way? Why not use embryos as a means of harvesting embryonic stem cells, especially when celebrities such as Nancy Reagan, Michael J. Fox, Stephen Hawking make such eloquent appeals through their various forms of suffering from genetic-based disease for more stem cell research, and in light of the fact that some scientists claim that there is some substantive difference between embryonic pluripotent stem cells and induced pluripotent stem cells. Surely it is not enough for science to rely only on the latter kind. Full scientific knowledge can be attained only by exploring all possible avenues of research. And we value both scientific knowledge and its benefits to humankind. So because they are so different from us, we cannot imagine the destruction of human embryos constituting any kind of real harm. Or at least, if it is a harm, it seems to pale in comparison with the great gains that could be made, at least in principle. Not everyone shares this particular set of values, of course, but our beliefs and values are behavioral phenotypes, and like all other phenotypes, they are the byproduct of some genotype-environment interaction. As such, values and beliefs, too, are candidates for genetic engineering. Behavioral phenotypes, of course, are dependent upon such a complex array of genes that there's no way with our present technology of establishing anything like a reasonable picture of their genetic basis. And combining this with the complexity and variety of environmental interactions that are possible, one gets what looks like a virtually infinite array of possible genetic linkages, and something involving that many variables seems irreducibly complex. But virtually infinite is not the same thing as literally infinite. And as long as the possibilities are finite, they are susceptible of computational analysis. But as promising as it might seem to us to look to a future where racist, sexist, and other unattractive value systems have been cured, so to speak, we ought nevertheless to tread very carefully here. There's nothing wrong in principle with manipulating a genome in order to bring about changes in a population. Normativity enters into it only when the domain of goals and methods is raised. Why do we want to change the genome? And what means will we use to discover how to do it and then bring it about? And what makes us want to believe so very strongly that our own values regarding goals and methods ought to be shared by everyone, including the future generation that we are setting out to engineer? Thank you.
My name is Scott Robe. I apologize that my voice is a little weak. I've had a cold. I'd like to note my admiration for the remarkable achievements of engineering, genetics, modern science. And I must note as a disclaimer, I'm not a biologist, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a professional philosopher. I am an attorney, and I want you to know how much I admire my colleagues in their respective trainings and research. Both are accomplished scholars. I practice law, and let me distinguish myself therefore a little bit today and perhaps lower the bar. Lawyers are always interested in the burden of proof, so although I am an attorney at law, I really present here today, I think, more as a citizen, a publicly spirited citizen indeed, and a citizen with some legal training and practice. But any of you in the audience could occupy my seat here, really, and my contributions and yours will be useful and necessary precisely because, for mostly, we are citizens. In our civilization, this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Ours is not emphatically a government of lawyers, nor administrators, nor engineers, nor scientists, and especially not, thank God in these moments, not of congressmen, senators, and presidents. In regard to bioengineering, we as a people are presented with issues, many issues of first impression to our civilization, issues which relate to the very basic issues at the foundation of what it means to be a civilization. Like, what is a human being? What is included in the category of human? What rights attach to that category? What responsibilities do we individually owe to individuals in that category called human? What responsibilities does the whole people owe as a whole civilization? What liberty do we have not merely to remedy ailments and diseases by manipulation and modification of genetic material, but also to reinvent it? And finally and foremostly, if we may call this entire set of rights and responsibilities the field of ethics, then what is the ground for such rights and responsibilities? What is the ground of responsibilities which makes them obligations? What is the ground of rights which makes them right? What is the ground of rules of right and wrong which renders some things right and some things wrong? As a citizen with legal training, I suggest that because the pace of discovery is so fast and the implications of such potential benefit, but also potentially so grave, that we ought not to hazard haste that is not hastening to answer these questions. When I was in high school many years ago, I recall being assigned by my English teacher in Athens, the famous Betty Hoyt Fuller, to read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Huxley shared with me his prescient insight of just where a liberal democratic society as ours just might go if its concept of human dignity were not capable of finding a rightful means of both developing and harnessing technology and also making it subordinate to human dignity. The bioethicist Leon Kass from the University of Chicago has, in a number of his works on bioethics, echoed Huxley's tacit warning. In Kass's words, modern science and its cousins engineering and technology are both wonderful tools to serve humankind, easing difficulty, rescuing lives, healing, if only for a time, but also tools to achieve what he calls mastery over nature, a mastery which, if our concept of human dignity is not sufficiently and logically grounded in an intelligible ground, may end up enslaving us, actually. Amidst the various issues we could discuss today are these. And I'm glad that my colleague, Mr. Hook, is an expert in the area of medicine. We could discuss embryos. What or perhaps who are they? Embryonic stem cell research, human experimentation, modification of the genome for reasons other than remedying existing human diseases, ownership of parts of the human genome, inventing new species of organism, ownership and commoditization of human parts and genetic structures and information. What interests me most as a citizen and as a citizen with legal training is twofold. First, as Leon Cass put it, pursuing wisdom in order that we may be wise about our great feats of engineering and finding in that wisdom and establishing from it a framework of law, not mere ad hoc assemblage of inconsistent results by which to address the achievements of bioengineering. In that pursuit of wisdom, we must, I reiterate, discover two things: a framework of law on which we may develop a sensible and consistent systematic application of rules to fact situations, and a foundation from which that framework logically flows, a foundation to make intelligible that framework, a foundation which renders the whole of human experience as we actually and existentially live it, including biotechnology, make sense. It is the grounding of that set of great ideas of bioethics that is needed. So what are the outlines of such a framework and such a foundation? First, I suggest that our civilization already has one, composed by the remarkable women and men of our founding. And it is for us to apply and extend those principles laid down. Second, that basis of a framework and foundation are outlined in that great legal instrument which serves as our charter of incorporation, as it were, the Declaration of Independence. Third, the elements of that framework are that law is founded on truth, or rather is an expression of truth. The Declaration says it this way: the laws of nature and of nature's God are expressed in particular discrete truths. These truths of law are, in brief, all humans are created equal. All humans are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these rights, unalienable ones, are the right to live, the right to liberty, the right to own and make and acquire and transfer property in pursuit of happiness, and that government exists to secure these rights. Notice these facets of that framework. The question of what is human is a factual question, perhaps obvious to some, but a factual question more and more in modern times disclosed by science, in the science of biology and embryology. To each such biologically human individual attaches the rights of personhood. To each such human attaches the right of equality, legal equality. Each human is before the law legally equal, meaning no human is any more nor less human than any other. And to each human attaches the rights I mentioned: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which we in some call personhood. So humanness is a factual question. Personhood is a philosophical or legal principle which attaches to the human. To paraphrase what Martin Luther King Jr. observed about racial equality, the denial of equality or justice anywhere undermines the principle of equality everywhere. This framework is founded upon an explicit and unapologetic foundation of law, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Our founders did not faint from identifying that foundation with a person, the person of God, the Creator, whom the Declaration refers to 4 times as God, Creator, Supreme Judge, and protecting divine providence. Nor was this an inactive, uninterested person, as European continental deism held. He was a lawgiver, to be sure, and creator, but also supreme judge who took appeals, divine providence, whose interest was in the rightness of a human's intentions, and who exercised himself in the protection of those who firmly relied upon him. Now, why is this point important? Because this serves as the intelligible ground for ethics, to ground the concepts of human dignity, the concepts of authority, of obligation, of law, of right, in a foundation which makes sense, which makes those concepts make sense, which makes them meaningful, real, significant, and intelligible. We have more modernly sought to dismiss the personalness of the ground of ethics as mere religion, belief, irrationality. I suggest to the contrary, when we depart from that personal ground, that we render ethics potentially, philosophically, not intelligible. For without an intelligent, rational, living authority who bears truthfulness, choice, and will, there is, as I think, no basis for any obligation, no reason why I must do this or why I must do that. The critical criterion is the authority of that personal author, and we, his authored creatures. To neglect, or worse, to jettison that source is perhaps to play dice with ethics and the wonderful systems of ethical principles that so many ethicists have endeavored to work out in our civilization. Let me make two other points about this. It is not that there are not modernly other schools of ethics proposed. In his fine book, Bioethics, Louis Vaughan describes several theories of morality: utilitarianism, Kantianism, natural law ethics among them. He also cites three criteria, but evaluating those moral theories. But each has analytical use so far as they go. But in each case, what lacks is an answer to the basic question: why should that be the rule? How does that form an obligation? And each school of ethics has some usefulness, provided each first grounds ethics in the reason why anything can be good or not, an obligation or not. So one might call the Declaration's view of ethics the divine character philosophy of ethics, rather than merely the sometimes discredited divine will theory of ethics. The basic point is that a system of ethics must accord with a most basic set of foundational beliefs. And that system must be such that it continually reinforms that foundation. One of the facts our civilization has been blessed with and needs to be careful not to take for granted is that in the Declaration of Independence both occurred. We as a people held a broadly theistic, even broadly biblical foundation philosophically, which generally informed a framework of ethics. But two questions arise. What do we most foundationally believe to be true? And what rights, obligations flow from that foundation? What I have suggested concerning the human experience of ethical reality might just as readily be said of logic, the laws of thought, the human mind, the principle of induction, and the intelligibility of nature to the human mind. It's important to appreciate what happened upon the Declaration. A revolution that's hardly ever celebrated occurred. A revolution that separated from the feudal and slavery elements of European civilization. And proceeding from it was the U.S. Constitution and categories of law upon which we stand, which we hardly think about today. Systems of criminal, property, contract, tort law, etc., all proceeding from that foundation and framework. So, on that framework of ethics, we could derive a few rules of bioethics. If the thing is human, then respect it as human. In order to do research, obtain from the human person consent. In order to profit from the commercial use, also obtain consent. Human dignity, though, does impose limits upon the commoditization of things human. A human person has a privacy right in his or her genome. Modification of the genome should follow only permissible purposes. And standards of care should be developed to govern conduct regarding genetic testing and treatments. What standards? Negligence, strict liability? That's for this civilization to determine. And it's for our society to develop standards against unjust discrimination based on genetic information makeup. It's for us to develop laws regulating permissibly patentable genomic products, and to develop perhaps products liabilities laws regarding genetic commodities. And finally, to develop environmental laws regulating the safe exposure of genetic products in the environment.
Well, thank you all. One of the interesting things about this panel is we have groups of individuals representing different perspectives. As a molecular microbiologist, I have manipulated a few genes in bacteria, all with very good intentions. And what we largely do is spend our time talking to others who are doing the same thing. Seldom do we get together with a group as diverse as this to actually consider what we're doing in a broader context. And in addition to the three panelists here, we have a fourth component, which is the audience, because I think all of us as academics, or having been through the systems, understand that the questions that come from students are by far, in a way, the things that keep us honest. Because when we talk to ourselves, we're very reluctant to admit we don't know anything, and students don't take the pat answers quite as well as our colleagues do. So we're looking forward to hearing the questions from the audience, and if you have issues, if you come to the microphone, and we'll accept your questions. But let me get started here by asking the panel, from your unique perspectives, how do you view genetic engineering? How would you define that, and what are the real issues that you see with where we're at this point?
Okay.
Doctor?
Well, I look at, as a lumper, I see that there are two major ways in which we can modify the genes of an individual. When we hear the term genetic engineering, I think our minds immediately jump to one aspect of that, which is to literally implant a specific gene through a vector, whether that's a virus or now a nanoparticle of some size is being developed to replace a malfunctioning gene if we're looking at it therapeutically, or to implant a gene to produce a given product, such as in bacterial recombinant DNA manipulation, or to make bunnies glow green, as we've seen pictures of that. But there's another aspect of genetic engineering which has a much longer history and pedigree, and that includes selective breeding. And my parents were children of the eugenic era, and I was always cautioned on the importance of marrying well, you know, of marrying a girl of the right stock, because of the influence that would have on our children. And we see this in agriculture as we select breeds and do these various things. And that is all a form of genetic engineering or manipulation. Now, with the development of reprogenetic technologies such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, we are also able to do that screening on a more fine-tuned basis, where embryos are conceived in vitro, single blastomere is removed, various forms of genetic testing are performed upon it to see if that embryo, for instance, does or does not have a specific disease which the parents are trying to avoid in their offspring, or does that individual have the appropriate HLA markers, the human lymphocyte antigen markers, to allow that child, after implantation and development and birth, to serve as a potential bone marrow stem cell donor or organ donor for a sibling. And that is also a form of genetic engineering.
Mr. Robe, from the regulatory point of view, how do you see genetic engineering as an activity that should or should not be going on?
Well, first, it's my understanding that although concerning stem cell research, there is a good bit of regulation, at least concerning federal funds, in the area of, say, the screening or the analysis of the genome of an embryo. There is not a lot of regulation in the United States, whereas there is in Europe. It's kind of an interesting switch. And so there are labs making tremendous developments toward identifying this or that gene. And I think there's one report that where one genetic engineer says that it won't be long before they can, with a high degree of accuracy, be able to engineer, say, a baby with blue eyes. So the question is, how do I view it? I think I view it in terms of the purpose. I wouldn't say that I know have worked out all the detail, but that is something our civilization has to do. The question is the purpose one that's a permissible purpose? So one could maybe think innocuous, the genetic engineering of a baby for blue eyes. But of course there's a question that comes along with it. Do we really know what that engineering consequence has worked? Do we really know that that we know exhaustively the information that was just switched? And there's the potential for some responsibilities to that baby should it not be, should the information content not really be as well known as it could have been known. So how does the legal system develop that? I suppose there would be standards of negligence. I can guarantee you that there will be part of the trial lawyer bar that will be right after that. And perhaps there will be legislative responses as to products liability. You know, in terms of the regulation, it will come, even if it comes through the results of litigation. So I think it does from the government regulation standpoint. It depends upon the purpose. We as a culture need to decide what purposes are permissible and do we really know what we're doing.
Professor Carson, from a philosophical standpoint, is genetic engineering any different from what Dr. Hook was talking about in choosing a better spouse or a Seattle
I would
slew?
never do that. My spouse is just fine. But I think from the philosophical point of view, what Dr. Hook said is in fact very congenial. There was a time in philosophy when many philosophers thought that if you were going to define something, whether it be genetic engineering or some other process or procedure, you would need to specify certain necessary and sufficient conditions that would enable anyone to tell whether this or that is an example of what is being defined. And that was sort of useful for certain kinds of concepts. For example, you know, what is a bachelor? Well, it's an unmarried male. So if you want to find out if the person's a bachelor, you just ask him two questions. Are you married? Maybe you don't need to ask if he's a male, right? It might be obvious. But when it comes to procedures and processes and methodologies in the sciences, one of the things that the philosophers of science have just been sort of discovering in the past 20, 30 years is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to nail these things down with necessary and sufficient conditions of that kind. Just to take one sort of well-known example from the philosophy of science, the concept of fitness in evolutionary biology was understood for the most part by working biologists as the number of offspring that could be generated by an organism. And it was usually measured in terms of realized reproductive success. How many did it actually have? But it turns out that when we think about fitness as a concept, we sort of have this association in our mind that it ought to be sort of forward-looking. I don't want to know just how many puppies did this dog have. I want to know, is this dog going to provide more puppies than this other dog given this environment we have? So that led philosophers to sort of think about trying to redefine fitness in a way that would be prospective in its reach. And that proved to be very difficult to do. And lots of different philosophers of science tried lots of different approaches to define it in a way that was not only going to satisfy them in terms of the prospective nature of it, but that would also track what working biologists are actually doing, right? So with respect to genetic engineering, I would say if someone asked me to define it, I would have to sort of adopt what I would call a kind of pluralism. Because you do have the kind of basic sort of eugenic sorts of things that everyone knows about from the farm. That's clearly a kind of genetic engineering, and it's been going on for centuries, right? But now we have this much more technical and sort of wildly hopeful version of it that promises all kinds of benefits if we can just master the techniques. And there might be other ways that you would, other things that you would want to include under this rubric. So my own inclination as a philosopher of science is to say that, just as Mr. Robe is suggesting that, we need to turn to the culture and to the society and the civilization to look for the moral framework within which to assess these kinds of questions. We need to look to the scientific community to understand better what sorts of procedures and methods will count as instances of genuine genetic engineering. Because unless we do that, if it's just going to be some philosopher in office saying, well, you missed this necessary condition, so that's not really genetic engineering, that's not going to satisfy the lawyers, right? or the people who want their problem treated or what have you. So I think that what Dr. Hook said is very good, right? It sort of gets at this sort of wide variety in the possible kinds of things that could reasonably be counted as genetic engineering, and it keeps us mindful of the fact that these are early days with respect to many of these technologies, and many other things that we haven't even thought of might come up that are going to have to be counted as instances of genetic engineering, at least for the sort of legal purposes that we have to keep in mind.
All right, so can we encourage members of the audience, if they have a question, to come up to the microphone? You have a comment.
While someone's coming up, I want to follow up on a very interesting thing that Professor Carson just mentioned. One of the many ironies of the eugenics program of the early 20th century. And you mentioned the concept of biological fitness, which is reproductive success. And yet, the goal of the eugenics program was to define certain categories of human beings as unfit, of not having worth. And what they were really saying was not in a biological sense, in the sense of reproductive capability, but fitting some sort of a social norm or a social desire. They were labeled unfit, and yet the problem was what made the eugenicists all lie awake at night and wring their hands in distress and disgust was that the unfit were actually incredibly biologically fit and quite capable of reproducing successfully. And so there was this paradox, essentially of biological reality and socially imposed definitions.
So the term eugenics has now got a rather unfortunate context in modern society. Is genetic engineering a molecular replacement, and does it suffer from the same downside?
Yes. To the extent that we are using these technologies, I should make that a little bit more qualified, in the sense that, yes, if we are attempting to prevent certain diseases, genetic diseases, from afflicting coming generations, that can be done without the destruction of embryonic life or of preborn life through other forms of testing and cooperative agreements. There's a program called the Yeshiva Dor Yeshorim program within the Orthodox Ashkenazi Jewish population, which is an example of how genetic testing used can help people make certain decisions about whether to marry and have children without invoking the idea of having to destroy an existing human life to prevent genetic disease. But other aspects of this are still of the same eugenic orientation. We are going to select the desirable individuals, the people that have genetic utility to us. And in that sense, it is identical to the goals of the historic eugenic movement.
So this gets us to beyond the ability to just cure diseases that people sort of intuitively feel is a noble cause, to the question of what is normal, what do we want to define people in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Are we, will genetic engineering force us to answer that question, or is it going to help us do something, and who decides? Sounds like the philosopher.
Well, these are definitely normative questions, right? And the whole purpose of my introductory remarks was to sort of emphasize that these values don't come out of nowhere. You know, they are themselves learned traits and can be manipulated, and that's why the legal task to sort of find some framework within which the relationship between our values and the methods and goals that we pursue can in some sense be monitored, at least, to make sure that you don't run into the sorts of problems. I mean, it's always maybe problematic to invoke sort of wild science fiction-like scenarios where I'm suggesting that, you know, maybe the values themselves could be engineered. But it's something that's in principle possible, and you have to think about, you know, what right you would have to do something like that, and what, as Mr. Robe put it, what is it that's going to ground your normative claim that not only this is a good thing to do, but that you have some business doing it. And that's where I think it does get, you know, science itself is, it has sort of two faces to it. One face of science is allegedly value neutral, right? Many climate scientists agree that the climate is changing. The other face of science, though, is not so value neutral. Many climate scientists do not agree among themselves with regard to what we ought to do about climate change. So you wind up getting public policy proposals, not just from public policymakers, but from scientists themselves. And I think an important philosophical point to note here is that the data and scientific theories of science do not say anything about normativity. They do not actually give you any information about what you ought to do or how you ought to accomplish a goal. They are straightforward facts, data. They have no normative content apart from what we impart to it, right? So if the scientific community begins to believe that they're in a position, or maybe a better position than others, to say what we ought to do based on their scientific knowledge, that's an area where we have to be very careful and say, you know, be quick to point out that they're not any more qualified than anyone else to say what we ought to do. And that's where I think Mr. Robe comes in, right? To sort of say, you can't do that.
If I could, it seems to me really important that although the question of what is normal to a genome is really a scientific question, it's a factual question. However, whatever tools would be used to figure out what's normal to the genome, and certainly science needs to be at work trying to find out, and we owe such a debt to scientific discovery. But that is just a factual question. It's my understanding that it's possible that the genome over time is actually, if you look at it from a big perspective, the genome is actually degrading, or it can degrade, and that's a big problem. And it may be something, a great mission of medical science to try to stem that or repair that, if that can be done. But it's really a citizen's task. It really is. This is something that we in a democratic, liberal democratic society have to take responsibility for. It's our job to figure out what kind of a society we are, what are our framework, what's our framework of ethics, what's our ground, and then to speak, to medical science, to speak to through the appropriate means, legislatures or what, as to what is it that's permissible, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And since I'm not a biologist, not a geneticist, I can't speak to the biology of it.
Well, that seems a great segue to get to one of our citizens. Is there anyone that would like, please come forward to the microphone and pose your question.
Actually, following up on your point of that we need to be responsible as citizens to decide what to do with this information, I wanted to ask a question linking back to Dr. Hook's opening remarks. Before I do that, I wanted to ask Dr. Carson, what was the outcome of the debate on the Nazi data, of whether or not that could be used?
Well, Berger's paper was very thorough, and he was able to show very conclusively that those data can't really be counted as scientific in any meaningful sense of the word. So it's basically useless data.
Okay. So following up with that information, which I was just curious to know, Dr. Hook, you mentioned that with the centralization of healthcare, the use of genomic information becomes very important. And Mr. Robe mentioned that as citizens, we need to decide what to do with our knowledge of the genome. So what are the pros and cons, and this is really for all the panelists, what are the pros and cons as we centralize our healthcare system and we get increasing knowledge of the genome, and with personalized medicine we probably have the knowledge of every individual's genome? What are the pros and cons of the centralization of that?
Well, pros would be the ability to share that information across providers, which would allow, let me step back and say that so much of therapeutic advances and diagnostic advances occurs through cooperation across centers and the accumulation of large amounts of information in order to fully understand if a certain difference in a gene is actually a pathological mutation, or a benign mutation, or maybe even a beneficial mutation. And so having a centralization of that information to allow an understanding of those inherent differences is going to be a pro. A potential con, however, is who else gets access to that information besides researchers and providers. We'll see if we're going to have universal care without consideration of predisposition. It's a very expensive way to proceed. The insurance industry has historically always tried to stratify risk in order to keep premiums at a low for some individuals and to try to distribute some of the shared risk across a larger population. So if insurers, have an opportunity to specifically predetermine an individual's complete risk, how is that going to influence the economics of how we cover one another for health care? What about this information might be used as a means of stratifying risk for investigation or monitoring by enforcement agencies? There's been some claims, and again, probably one of the most tenuous areas of genetic studies right now is in the area of psychogenetics, where one author quipped at one time that psychogenetic information is the only academic field in which you can leave 97.5% of a phenomenon unexplained and still get headlines. But yet there have been clear correlations between certain mutations in monoamine oxidase genes in terms of violent behavior. Now that has to be coupled with psychosocial stress and a variety of other important factors. But as we know, we're moving to a society of increased surveillance and monitoring of supposedly at-risk individuals. Is this going to lead to further invasion of the privacy of some individuals based upon their genetic structure? So again, some good, some bad there.
So now we've sort of drifted into an area of personalized medicine where the technology has got so efficient you can get a rough copy of your genome sequence for around $500. And that then opens up a way to interrogate your genome. And while 500 makes it fairly widely available to many, the therapy that might be predicted on that personalized medicine screen is going to be very expensive. Is there a real concern for equity in personalized medicine? Mr. Robe?
Well, of course there would be. We live in a time when medical care, health care through Medicare programming and Medicaid programming is a public benefit, and it would be a major question as to just what kind of treatment can be afforded. Of course, obviously at the congressional level, they're trying to figure out what can and cannot be afforded, and I don't pretend to know the answer to that. But it will be an issue, and it will be an issue of equity. Is it an offered service, for instance, in Medicare, Medicaid, and then in the various exchanges under the national healthcare system? And if it's offered, to whom would it be offered? Or if it's private pay, that's really an issue of private morality, but it is an issue. In fact, most of the world will not be able to afford that kind of excellent care, and it's an issue that we as neighbors have to deal with. How do we deal with our neighbors who need the care?
So then on the broader questions of deciding whether or not we want to re-engineer, what would success look like in re-engineering humans? What are we actually trying to achieve here?
Well, that in and of itself is an area of substantial discussion of what we are attempting to accomplish. From a medical perspective, my interests are to do what we can to either prevent or have means of successfully treating diseases which are genetically based. That again goes back to the historical norms of medicine of being restorative or healing. Others, however, would propose that we should be dissatisfied with normal and that we should be making changes to try to amplify superior traits or to create new biological capabilities to go beyond what would be typically limited to the species of Homo sapiens. And so to those individuals, we might call them genetic transhumanists, that they would define success in entirely different ways than I would.
I'd have to agree with that. The notion of success is itself a kind of a value, right? It's and it's because of the relationship between what one takes to be an example of success and the means that are required to obtain that end that you get into the sorts of worries that I was talking about earlier. And I agree that not all forms of success should really be counted as successes by everybody, right? I mean, there's a famous, if I can wax a little philosophical here, a very famous dialogue of Plato in which a famous orator is being questioned by Socrates, and Socrates says, well, what do you have to offer? And he says, I can improve the young men of Athens. They will be able to speak on any topic and win any debate. And you know, this is a tool that everyone needs, even the doctor, right? A doctor needs to be able to persuade the patient that this course of treatment is the best for him, right? And so Socrates says, so you need to know how best to apply your rhetorical methods, what sorts of ends to apply them to. And his interlocutor says, yes, I do. And Socrates says, well, what if the person decides to use rhetoric to bring about some really horrendous end? And that's where the interlocutor, Gorgias is his name, says, oh, no, no, we would never do that. We would never train anyone to use rhetoric for evil ends. But it turns out, right, that that's what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is persuasion. So to be successful as an orator is nothing more than to have persuaded someone to do something. It doesn't matter what you persuade them to do. You're successful if you do that. And Socrates' point, or really Plato's point, is that that's where we should start to worry, when success is defined simply in terms of some kind of utilitarian, I got what I wanted, rather than in terms of, this is genuinely good for people, this is what we ought to pursue. The orator, according to Socrates, doesn't have any expertise in that domain. And that was sort of what I was suggesting earlier when I said, you know, not every scientist necessarily will have expertise there either. I would rather trust this doctor than many others to tell me what is really good for me and how best to achieve that. I suspect that there are plenty of people with the same level of training and expertise who might suggest something different. So the science itself will not settle these issues. So what counts as success has to be weighed very carefully.
Did you have?
Go ahead.
I was just going to lay out a scenario just to get your comments on. There have been some cases in which we have been able to conceive of the idea of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select for congenital deafness, which has actually been desired by some deaf parents because they prefer that their offspring remain members of the deaf community. They see their culture is very unique and it has its own values, and they want their children to be a part of that, whereas if they were hearing, they could still communicate, but it is not the same, that they would fully be part of that community. And then there was a survey, it's done many years ago, in which 16%, I think it was at least 16%, of the deaf individuals surveyed said that yes, they would use reprogenetic technologies to specifically select for deaf children. Now, on a biological sense, if we created deaf children, that would be a success. From a medical sense, that says that congenital deafness is a disability which can potentially be life-shortening and a number of other things, would that be seen as a success? And yet, do they not have the freedom to make that selection as parents?
I would wonder legally, you remember where I begin with this is that if something is a human, it's a who, then certain rights attach to that biological fact. And one of the rights is the right to liberty, including liberty of choice. So I would really wonder, isn't that the child's choice? Or, I don't know if you could say nature's choice. I don't know what choosing or not is going on there. I don't pretend to know biology so well. But there at least is this question. Isn't it the child's choice in some respect to not have certain things chosen for the child? And it's for the parents. I don't know if parents regard it in this way, but I would just suggest to be careful and gentle. That's something really to work through carefully and appropriately. And then the other thing is, when we're doing, back to a point I made earlier, when we're doing selection, I guess I don't know, but I would ask the scientific question, do we really know that we're not doing more than we think we're doing? And I ask the scientists the question, if I may interject a question, and that is, it's my understanding that the Human Genome Project has just been a tremendous benefit in terms of the amount of knowledge that we've gained, and that more recently there's been a better understanding of not just the information in the genome that codes for proteins, but also epigenetic information, and I know enough to ask the question.
Well, I think you've hit on a great deal of complexity here, that we're more than our genes, and we've mentioned a couple of times the dual use of things, whether you argue for good or evil, whether you have unintended consequences. You know, we've seen the elimination of smallpox from the face of the earth that made it the ideal bioterrorist agent. But if we're going to have a genomic definition of normal against which we look to enhance, does this then raise the question, will people, perhaps student admissions, require you to submit your genome sequence? How do the students feel about their future careers being determined by the A, C, T's, and G's in their genomes? Does that bother you at all?
Bothers this guy.
Well, I think that comes to say that we all have a right to privacy. So there was a recent case in California where employers were requesting students and prospective employees to provide their Facebook logins to look at their Facebooks and say, is this person an acceptable employee? Do they do things that we want? Do they have our values? But that was ruled to be illegal because it invades their right to privacy. I think that's the same thing. Your DNA is yours. It's not someone else's. You might have some mutation that gives you great abilities to do something, but unless you give that to someone else, they don't have the right to access it. So I think that comes into play. But I also must mention this. Every day our bodies are shedding skin and DNA onto the ground. And does that say we're throwing that away? Is that trash now? Is that someone else can access that? Because I know there's already cases where, I know in New York City, there's an artist that collects cigarette butts, and they have saliva in them, and they sequence the DNA out of the cigarette butts, and they come up with an idea of what the face would look like, what type of race do they come from, and develop features of the person, what color eyes, hair color, and then they create models of these people and they show like the cigarette butt and then the person's face. So I think it brings up a much more complicated question of, are we actually giving our DNA away freely every day, or is it something that it's private to us? So I put that out there.
So from the forensic standpoint, DNA is a very powerful tool in the legal system. We're hearing questions of privacy and who owns your DNA.
Well, from the public probably does have an interest in using DNA information for public purposes, but that doesn't mean for every purpose. So, say if there's a parentage issue, our civilization has decided that the government should be able to get that, to acquire that information in order to prove parentage, or it may be DNA evidence in order to circumstantially prove a crime. We've certainly made that decision that that's allowable. But that doesn't mean for every purpose. So, for instance, I would agree with what I think the gentleman is suggesting, that's a problem. I don't think one could infer from throwing a cigarette butt away that you expressed an intention to give away your genome, the genomic information. So I'm pretty sure there aren't laws on the books that prohibit that, but I would think that would be an arguable invasion of privacy. But I don't know any case that's made that decision.
So when it comes to the use of genetic information for determining suitability for specific activities, say like an airline pilot, when does it become acceptable to know whether somebody who's got that sort of responsibility has a predisposition to do something suicidal, perhaps?
I would ask the scientific question, and that is, do we know enough from the genetic information to be able to decide empirically that there are certain predilections or proclivities?
Well, this becomes very challenging because we can now test for certain diseases such as Huntington's disease, which we know is a neurodegenerative disorder and sometimes begins with a subtle loss of emotional control, of judgment, as well as perhaps fine motor activity. And yet an individual who, and since Huntington's has 100% penetrance, you know, it's a very terrifying disease. So the question is, should the airlines, as you're postulating it, or force an employee who has a family history of Huntington's to undergo genetic testing in order to secure a pilot's license? And you know, this becomes very challenging because the airline is charged with the public safety, and at the same time, with appropriate frequent neurological testing, it is unlikely that the individual would be allowed to fly, putting the public at a risk. And yet, what if the individual didn't want to know? Some folks with Huntington's make the decision that they simply don't want to know prospectively if they're going to get it or not. And they have now lost the freedom of remaining in ignorance. And that's been an area of hot debate within the bioethics community about what the obligations are. Is there an obligation to know? Is there a freedom not to know? And it's still unresolved.
We have a question from the floor?
Yeah. So Dr. Hook touched on this while talking about the idea of restorative justice, the idea of augmentation, and I was just wondering on how you were able to separate out the dimensionality of something as being restorative versus something being augmentative, and sort of how you analyze what exactly the dimensionality difference between the two of those is, if there is any at all.
Right.
I just sort of want to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. An outstanding question, and actually it's the $1,000 question when it comes to the consideration of what's healing and what's augmentative or enhancing. And you know, this has been one of the biggest challenges, but in medicine, at least, I am confronted on a regular basis with what are disease states, have been acknowledged as abnormal physiological functioning. And we can attribute that to a specific mutation in a gene or a series of mutations. Those are the easy ones, and I think non-controversial. We can take an individual who has essentially normal functioning, normal strength, normal intellectual functioning, normal vision, normal hemostatic function, and we can say we're going to genetically dope an individual to have increased sensitivity to erythropoietin.
Assuming that individual provides consent.
Right. That's, you know, that they are desiring that sort of an enhancement. So an athlete would say, yes, I would like to do that. I don't need to, you know, do the Lance Armstrong thing of the shots of erythropoietin. My body can just do it itself. But yet that really is not necessary for the biological success of the individual. They're functioning normally, so we're going beyond. And I think that's a nice, clear example of, you know, on the other side, that would be an enhancement. The difficulty, which we all acknowledge, would be those in which perhaps the behavior is considered statistically normal, but yet at the same time may have its own pathological implications. And there, we talk about things like lipid metabolism and some of those concerns. So, am I answering your question?
I just want to, there's a transhumanist author by the name of Eliza Yudowski. And he makes the argument that if it would be considered a net good to prevent a disorder that would reduce someone's IQ by, say, 10 points, correct?
Well,
it would be ethical to do so.
That has been...
provided the individual provides consent.
Are you saying that the individual is below the...
The individual has an IQ of, say, 120, and there's a condition that might lower it down to 110.
Okay.
It would be ethical to prevent that condition, provided that the individual provides consent, correct?
So you're taking someone like who has a neurodegenerative disease, and they will be losing that function over time.
Correct.
Okay.
So if that situation is considered ethically good, then in what way does the reverse direction suddenly become ethically bad? He sort of gives the idea of transhumanism as basically simplified humanism, in that if someone preventing the lowering of IQ is a good thing, then raising that IQ from, say, that person's sister or something has an IQ of 110, and they might be able to take a drug that might raise them up to 120. Wouldn't that necessarily, by the same reasoning, be considered a net positive and be considered ethically justified, provided consent is provided?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. First of all, is in the one it is truly restorative, because there's a pathology which has caused the loss of function. And what we are attempting to do by intervening is to either prevent that loss, that disease, or to restore what has been taken from the individual. So we're still in the realm of restoration. The other is to say that the individual is normal, they have not had something taken from them, and now they're just simply dissatisfied with who they are. And it has nothing to do with restoration. It has to do with changing who they are. So there's a lot of issues. What about our society has made an individual who is actually well-functioning within the realm of society to say, I need more, I'm not good enough? What is it about our society that we can't accept each other when people are not operating at the upper ends of the bell curve in all situations? I think that a lot of us are being forced to place unnecessary burdens on our inability to accept each other and ourselves as we are. And I do see that as an entirely different circumstance from restoration. I also see it as, what are we spending our health care dollars doing? Okay? Are we again restoring and healing, or are we trying to help people do wish fulfillment, which we can't afford?
Couldn't the same argument be used against someone who, say, might be apply that same argument and that same logic to someone? Why shouldn't someone be happy with the disease that nature has graced them with, I guess?
Well, I think you're taking a
huge,
if I'm hearing you correctly, you're taking a huge leap from acceptance of normalcy and being happy with a disease state, which, again, we recognize as being less than normal. It is it's labeled disease because it is different from species-level norms of functioning and behavior.
There's clearly been a lot of interest generated in how society views things, and Mr. Robe talked earlier about the U.S. Constitution and some of the issues. But we're a very global society, and is the need now to have some
United Nations declaration type of thing, when we have all of this ability to manipulate genomes, which is a very sophisticated part of the world, and as you pointed out earlier, a third of the deaths in the developing world is due to dirty water. Do we really need to be starting to think of this not just from the context of the community we live in, but from a broader global perspective?
Well, I would think so. It's my understanding that the World Health Organization is pressing toward developing standards of ethics. I'm not personally familiar with them, but I am aware of the project. And because this will affect so many nations, certainly the European nations are leaders in some genetic research. Russia, China, all the industrialized nations are going to affect genetic information, definitely, and they should be approaching that both as nations and then to try to achieve some sort of unity of mind. I think so.
There is the UNESCO Declaration on the genome, which is about, 10 years old now. And the first 2 points were to recognize the dignity of all individuals regardless of their genetic makeup, and secondly, it is to say that there is a right to be free from enforced genetic manipulation.
We have time for one last question.
My question was back to something you had said earlier about the biological reality of survival and fitness versus social reality, and especially for humans, because I know that we are, as a species, fighting natural selection by curing diseases and a lot of stuff. So in terms of genetic engineering and improving humans for benefit, curing diseases, when reaching almost that superhuman point of curing all these diseases genetically, at what point, I guess, where do you secure the survival of those people, saying that they may not continue to reproduce, or they may not be socially the best fit, and with those increased genetic, with their, I guess, increased for survival genetic makeup, do you allow for more rights or more protection for them so that does, to secure their fitness?
Well, I think there's sort of two questions, at least, or maybe more. But if I could start off by just saying, I'm not really sure I completely agree with you that humankind is, in some sense, fighting against natural selection. The way I understand natural selection is it's just differential reproductive success given certain constraints, and the manipulations that we do to the genome are themselves a part of nature. And so in structuring the genome in a certain way, if that has differential, if that has consequences for reproductive success, then it is actually a kind of natural selection. There's this temptation, I think, to believe that the word natural means anything other than what we're doing, because we're people and people are not part of nature. But so I guess I would start off by saying this is in fact a really good example of natural selection. It's directed natural selection. We are directing it by means of manipulating the genome, and that's what is in some sense leading to the sorts of problems that I think you're indicating with the other part of your question, namely, so you've got these people who are, in some sense of the word, better fit, and what about the ones who are less fit on that calculus? So when it comes to that kind of a question, I would say there's always going to be, whether we're manipulating the genome or not, there are always going to be some people who are healthier, better performing, what have you, and it's incumbent on everyone to treat everyone in precisely the same way, for the reasons that Mr. Robe drew our attention to earlier. It's the foundation of justice and morality to say that regardless of whatever accidental differences might exist between me and him, there's some more fundamental sense in which he and I are the same thing. So he's probably a lot smarter than I am because he's at the Mayo Clinic, right? Or he might have some other genetic leg up on me that I don't know about, and so he might be healthier than I am. I don't know what his particular genotype is like. But I do know this. He's no better than I am when it comes to being a human being. And whatever is in his best interest as a human person is also in my best interest. So whoever is making these decisions is going to have, and this is in fact why racism, sexism, etc. are all wrong, because all of those isms treat people as being different simply for no other reason that they have different phenotypes, right? And that's what is intellectually, the thing that Mr. Robe was talking about, an intellectual foundation. You can't intellectually justify treating someone differently just because the phenotype that was expressed is different than what got expressed from yours.
Well,
Unfortunately, our allotted time has come to an end on a very interesting point. I'm not sure we have answered the question that was posed, but we certainly have raised a lot more that merit discussion. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our distinguished panel and the event organizers, the Ohio University student group, Ratio Christi, and also acknowledge the individual donors who made this event possible. Dr. Hook will be presenting a lecture tonight entitled The History of American Eugenics, Lessons for the Second Genetic Century in the Baker Ballroom at 8 o'clock, and that event will also be streamed live on this channel. My name is Michael Boyle. I'd like to thank you for joining us today in the brave new world of genomics.